That's not a real background.
Well, no. The background is when I took a picture when I was visiting Guilin. Um,
Right.
you know, Keju, right? The it's a system that have the Huangdi. We should use the term Huangdi instead of emperor. I think you're right. So that's how the Huangdi pick to find officials, right? To find people to put
Yeah,
into
I know
the.
the what we call the education system
Okay.
in yeah, and is it the Tsinshe and whatever
Uh-huh.
the various degrees.
Yeah,
I have a whole book about this here. The ones that 0.001% of the
the
people
people.
who took the exams actually passed
Yeah.
and all that. It's one of the great glories of China. Actually, it's one of the most amazing things that the Chinese people ever did. So what's this? Is this
So
a yeah.
So the statue behind me, I mean, they in Guilin, they're very proud that they had produced over years different dynasties. They produced different very good students, like put it that
Yeah,
way, so that they got really the best, and then they got
right.
to move to the next level, right? And then all the way to get to see the emperor. The last round is the Huangdi interview them, right?
That's fine.
That's
That's
I
fine.
find fascinating, and so they're very
Oh, it
proud.
is. It's,
Yeah, that they're very proud of that they have produced so many over the years. So there is it's just a part of it. They had the 10 people there that all the statues of the best students that they produced in that area in Guilin.
mm,
So I
mm.
find that's interesting. I find the
Oh, it
whole
is.
yeah. I mean the whole system is interesting that the Huangdi would pick. I mean many of these people coming from very humble backgrounds, right? And so this is their opportunity
Yeah.
to change their life, I guess. And
Yeah.
some of ended up very famous and really contributed greatly to the dynasty. So it's a very unique and interesting system, I think.
It is an extraordinary system, and it explains why China was so much better governed for most of its history than any other place in the world. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but when McCartney and his people came to China in the 18th century, and in fact, this isn't just McCartney, but all the Western visitors to China from the 16th century onwards, when the Westerners first started to arrive in China on a fairly regular basis, they were commenting on how law-abiding and orderly the country was. It's partly because
Yeah.
it was governed in such a strong and effective way. No, as I said, Catherine, because she's a literary person, is very, very interested in this because the idea of a country being governed by people who pass literary exams is incredibly exciting to her. So the people who study and teach literature in the great universities in Britain, at least, they're very conscious of the system and very, very wish that we had something like that here.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you're talking about Catherine. Scott, my husband, he's also academia. So, of
Yeah,
course, he's also find that's very interesting, fascinating, this
yeah,
process. And we talked about this. We said that, okay, in the US, there is an exam for public servant. So if you want to
yeah,
work in the post office, for example, you do need to pass exam. But you don't need to pass exam if you want to be the senator and the House of
no,
Members or
no,
governor,
no,
president. You don't
exactly.
need any exams. So that's something I find interesting. I'm not saying that you should have the highly, extremely difficult test
Yeah,
for people, but maybe some basic things, right? If you
no,
want to serve in the government in any capacity, you should pass a exam that at least you know your history, you know the
yes.
composition of the government, right? Stuff like that. Lots of the people I find in the U.S. Congress, they sometimes you wonder whether they have the common sense or the basic knowledge to run the country. That's my thought.
Abs-
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the Chinese system meant that China was governed by people of incredible intelligence, but also very refined intellectuals. I mean, people
Yeah.
extremely well informed about things, and very, very versed in the literature and the history of China, of the Chinese people, and that undoubtedly played an enormous role in making China such a the civilization and the country that it is. And we have a lot to learn from this. Now, back in the 19th, so just to quickly finish on this, back in the 19th century, the British government actually decided that it would introduce civil service exams. And the civil servants, the senior civil servants that the system created, they were actually called, and continue to be called in Britain, mandarins. Mandarin is the expression that's used to refer to the scholar officials. But if you look at their exams and you compare them with the exams that the Chinese officials had to pass, they are completely different. I mean, the Chinese exams were literature, philosophy, exams that were intended to deepen your understanding and knowledge of people and ideas, whereas the British exams are purely technical.
Yeah. Just so I find also this process that in the last round, the Huangdi interview these students.
Absolutely.
I think
Absolutely.
that's a good practice too for the Huangdi to talk to these people
Absolutely.
with very diverse backgrounds, right? I think that practice
Yeah.
itself, I think it's something
Hugely important.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it could sometimes produce great government. And in fact, it often produced great government. It always produced good, stable government, except, of course, during periods of great crisis, which happened to any country. But when the Huangdi was a really clever man, and China produced some very clever people who were, strong and clever people like that, it could produce great government. And it also meant that the government in Beijing or wherever the capital was, it had an ability to actually administer the country in a way that you would find in no other place on earth through all the great centuries of Chinese history. Anyway, we can talk about this forever. I mean, this is, as I said, whole books about this there. It's something that really has always interested me massively.
We need to talk about Syria. All right. So so the speed that Assad government fall is very stunning. Now, I saw you and Alex were talking about this on your Iran show. So you guys believe that he himself gave up. Do you think that's the main reason it fell so quickly, that he gave up?
No, it is not the main reason, but it's the proximate reason. It's that at the very end, even as all the various problems combined to make the situation in Syria very, very difficult, he seemed to lose hope and energy. I mean, it's important to remember that he was never somebody who wanted to be Syria's leader in the first place. So at some point, I think he got worn down. And his wife apparently has been very ill. And I think, they're clearly very devoted to each other. And I think this basically meant that he gave up hope. But if you look at what has happened to Syria, it has been under continuous siege for the last 20 years. It's been faced economic sanctions. It's faced repeated attempts at destabilization. It's had areas of its territory occupied by external powers. Israel has occupied part of the Golan Heights. Turkey has been involved in the north, in Idlib province and other places. The Americans occupy large stretches of Syria in the east, including the oil fields. It created an exhausting and very, very difficult situation. Now, a very strong, very dynamic leader, a leader like Bashar al-Assad's father, might have found a way through, probably would have found a way through, but Bashar al-Assad himself didn't. And, you can be critical of him, and I am to some extent, but he's not the person who bears ultimate responsibility for this disaster. The Americans, the Israelis, and the Turks do. And the British probably also.
Well, I don't quite understand their hatred toward Assad. I mean, Barack Obama pretty much put an order to bring him down, and Hillary Clinton is very much, Assad must go. Well, I mean, Assad lead a government who's secular. I mean, why are they hate? If there's one country in the Middle East that they should have find, some similarities with the West, it would be Syria. It would be Assad. Both of them, he and his wife, I believe, is Western educated,
Yeah.
right? I think they met in London or somewhere. Why do they hate Assad so much?
Well, Assad's wife went through a British private school, is
Oh,
highly educated, speaks fluent English, is profoundly British in many ways. You're absolutely correct. I mean, this is a man that they should have been able to work with and who was keeping Syria stable.
uh-huh.
And in the 1990s, under Assad's father, Syria had a growth rate of between 5 and 7% per year, which is a high growth rate by any standards
Mhm.
for a middle income country. And then under Bashar al-Assad in the first years, it was even more stable. And Bashar, the son, was opening up Syria to foreign investment, and he was doing all kinds of things of this kind. Absolutely, he was a person that they should have tried to work with, but he tried to lead an independent country. I mean, a country that had its own foreign policy, its own perspectives on international affairs, that wanted to play an active role in trying to sort out the issues in the Middle East. And of course, as we know, for the Americans especially, that simply isn't acceptable. So he had to go.
Okay. So it's still down to it is still too independent. And the US cannot okay, tolerate that. Okay. Well, then let's look at the consequences of that. Okay. There's so many things to unpack. Turkey. I don't understand Turkey.
Mm,
Turkey has been supporting the anti-government, anti-Assad, different rebellious group
yeah.
within Syria. I understand Erdogan and maybe other Turkish leaders, they worry about their Kurds within their border. I understand that. But if so, the Turks within Syria, I would think that you should work with Assad to make him stronger so that he can control better his own population, including the Kurds. Why do they trying to bring him down? And how can that help to solve their own Kurdish problem? I don't get that.
Well, I'm going to express my own view. I think I not only agree with you, I think what has been done is going to prove in the end to be a total disaster for
Yes.
Turkey. I mean, they had a stable country south of their borders, a united country, which included the Kurdish regions. The president of that country, Bashar al-Assad, was for many years Erdogan's personal friend. We tend to forget this, but they used to go on holiday together. They used to get on very, very well. What Erdogan has done by joining in the various attempts to overthrow Assad, going all the way back to 2011, is going to be a complete disaster for Turkey. He's created chaos on his southern border. He's provided a safe haven for all sorts of violent terrorist groups, many of whom have interests in Turkey itself. Turkey risks getting drawn in. As I said, in the end, it's going to be terrible for Turkey. Trying to understand Erdogan and what he's trying to do is never very easy. He does have some ideological affinity with some of the opposition to Assad. I mean, Erdogan is an Islamist politician. The opposition to Assad was also an Islamist opposition. They are actually, despite some ideological similarities, very different. I mean, Erdogan leads a political party that
Mhm.
functions within the structure of a secular state,
Mhm.
in which there are elections and things like that. Whereas, of course, the forces that have been unleashed in Syria have no interest in any of that. They want to create an Islamist state subject to the kind of religious controls that they want to impose. So they're in reality totally different. But anyway, there is that affinity, that sense, I think, that Erdogan is backing people close to himself. But I think ultimately, and being completely brutal about this, I think it's a power grab. I think Erdogan, ever since he became president of Turkey or leader of Turkey, he was prime minister for many years, has hankered after positioning Turkey again as a great power in the way that it was during the Ottoman years. Syria, of course, was a province of the Ottoman Empire. And I think that he's wanted to pursue this policy of making Turkey a great power again. He talks about this all the time. If you listen to read his speeches, by the way, he comes back to this again and again and again. And I think that his idea was, create a kind of vassal state in Syria, and that would somehow make one stage in reconstituting Turkey as a great power. Instead, he's going to reap the whirlwind because, as I said, he's got a chaotic, unstable Syria where he had a stable and at one time friendly Syria. The militants who are in power in Syria will probably at some point want to start interfering in Turkish politics as well, which will not be easy for Erdogan in any conceivable way. And Turkey has many economic problems. Inflation there is running at something like 50%, which is actually lower than it's been. It was 80% a short time ago. So Turkey cannot afford these things. But I think a thing that I have to say about Erdogan is, firstly, he's not a particularly well-educated man. I mean, he comes from a working class background in Istanbul. He's not a well-educated man. He's not made any serious attempt to educate himself about many of these things. He's very fiery, impulsive, strong-minded person who insists on having his way. He bears grudges, as he has against Assad. And I think a lot of this is driven by ambition and emotion.
In other words, so in 2011, it's 2010, that's when the Arab Spring started. So these different rebel groups started to appear in Syria. Erdogan see opportunity. So he saw that he believes that he could work with these people and gain influence and possibly gain territories in Syria. That's what he wants. Is that?
Yes. Yeah, that's
okay?
That is exactly what he wants. He wants to, I mean, Aleppo, there's always been, by the way, an irredentist movement in Turkey that says that Aleppo should be brought back under Turkish control, even though the people who live there are completely Arab. But I mean, he's had this issue. He seems to want to carve out some kind of protectorate in northern Syria, especially under Turkish control. How that ultimately benefits Turkey and its people, it's impossible for me to see. But anyway, this has been very much his outlook and his approach. The Turkish army, until the 2016 coup, strongly opposed him. But of course, after the 2016 coup, they were in no position to continue to do so.
And the coup, was that the one that eventually was Russia who alerted him? Okay.
Yeah.
So okay, but he still was mistreating Russia. Also, this time I think both Russia and Iran was pretty angry with him. I think Dugan even said something like Turkey betrayed Russia and Iran this time, and this is the start of of the downfall of Turkey. Something like that. Pretty strong words. I think that's what Alexander Dugan said.
Indeed, so, and it's important to remember that Dugan has in the past been a very, very strong advocate in Russia of good relations between Russia and Turkey. I mean, he's always seen Turkey as an essential part of his own concept of Eurasianism. So Dugan is absolutely furious, and his anger is very, very widespread in Russia as well. I mean, many, many people in Russia and within the government as well are absolutely furious with what has happened. And Putin is very embarrassed by it, even though for the moment he's maintaining this complex relationship that he has with Erdogan. But I think that what Dugan says is widely shared within Russia. The thing to say is that Erdogan and Putin have a very odd relationship with each other. They both work with each other, sometimes quite well. They both have mutual interests. They're both very skeptical of the European Union. They both have their resentments towards the West, but they've never been really friends. And on Erdogan's side, one always gets the sense that there's this seething resentment of Putin because Putin ultimately leads the more powerful country, which isn't something that Erdogan finds comfortable. So every so often, in fact, not every so often, very often, you have Erdogan work with the Russians and then do something that is completely contrary to what the Russians want. Like he advocates Ukraine's entry into NATO, for example, or as he's just done now, he engineers the overthrow of Assad in Syria. And there is an element, hitting back at Putin in some way, especially when Putin is looking somewhere else.
Yeah, and yeah, I told you, right, that in China people don't like Turkey that much because, again, I mean, I would think it's pretty stupid for him to truly believe that he could insert influence as far as in Xinjiang. It's far from Turkey. It's right there by, I mean, it is within China. Somehow he believed he could do that by supporting the separatist movement, the people there. I mean, they are many of them. It's not that many, but they are in Syria, and Turkey is supporting them. I mean, not openly, but we know Erdogan is supporting them. You know, why would you do that to upset China? I don't see any benefit for doing something like that.
It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But again, it is Erdogan. He wants to play the great leader, the person who plays this great game in the world. He wants to set himself out as a leader of that kind. He wants to present himself as the great defender of the Turkish-speaking nations and, the people in Xinjiang. I mean, they speak a Turkish-related language and all of those things.
Yeah,
But
no,
of course,
exactly
it makes absolutely no sense because what Erdogan wants, it's like what he wants with the Russians. He wants good relations with China. He wants good relations with Russia. He wants China to invest in Turkey. He wants Russia to supply gas to Turkey. He wants Russian tourists to come to Turkey. He wants good relations not just on economic matters, but on geopolitical matters with China. And at the same time, he wants to be dangerous and destabilizing and aggressive towards both of these countries. And because Turkey is important, and because Turkey has a lot of assets, a lot of cards to play, like for the Russians, access to the Black Sea, which we discussed in our previous programs. The Russians in particular grit their teeth and go along with this up to a point, though I think the Russians are becoming increasingly frustrated now. And I think this is going to be a major turning point. I mean, when the war in Ukraine is finished, I think Erdogan is going to find that the Russians are going to be a lot less accommodating than they have been previously. But with China, it is an even more dangerous game because ultimately Erdogan has no leverage over the Chinese at all. If he really makes them angry, which he could quite easily do, I mean, they could say enough's enough. We've had enough of this impossible man. Let's leave him to himself and let's get on with our other business with all sorts of other people who are ultimately more important to us.
Yeah, I actually think Turkey, I mean, Erdogan has been playing this pretty dangerous game. I don't think the US like him that much either. Otherwise, they wouldn't help with the coup and stuff like that. And so Erdogan has been playing the big powers, against each other in some ways. But I think eventually it will get to him. I think this game is too dangerous for him to handle, I think.
It is hugely overcomplicated, far too dangerous. And of course now he has this crisis in Syria, which he's created, and which I don't myself think he's going to be able to control. I mean, Syria is a large country. As I said, there's chaos there. The Israelis are there. Now Erdogan is up against all of this. And I think it's inevitable that this is going to spill into Turkey itself. And when it does, who will be there to help him?
Yeah.
Nobody.
Yeah. Yeah. Israel, do you think this is a big win for Israel? I mean, Netanyahu openly celebrated it, and now they're bombing Syria. So they are very busy taking, I think they're grab land there too. Do you think
Yeah.
that's what they're doing? But
I
here's my, go ahead.
No, go no, please continue. Yeah.
Well, but I think they are also very stretched very thin. They still have the Hamas problem, the Hezbollah problem, the Houthi issue, all that problem still there. And now they bring more military operations to themselves. Is that really that good idea?
Oh, it's a terrible idea, and I completely agree with you. I mean, in the immediate term, and for perhaps a couple of months or even years, this will work to Israel's advantage. I mean, Iran has been weakened because its major Arab ally has now disappeared. Hezbollah has been weakened because the main funnel through which Iran sends supplies to Hezbollah in Lebanon has now gone. But what has Israel ultimately got for itself? It controls more Arab land. It's brought more Arabs under its control. It's already finding it very difficult to control the Arabs it has, and now it's got more of them. I mean, it's increased its problem with an even bigger Arab population that it's now controlling than it had previously. These people that it's now going to control are heavily infected now with jihadi Islamist ideologies, which are identical to the ones of Hamas in Gaza. They've shown that they're violent, some of them very violent, very dangerous people. Israel's going to find it very, very difficult to control them. And of course, Syria is a big country. It can't be controlled as easily as Gaza has been controlled. And even in Gaza, we see the problems that Israel has. Israel is catastrophically overextended. But again, it has this imperialist drive, which it is, by the way. Netanyahu, if you read his books and publications going all the way back to the 1990s, has always been the great advocate of Israeli expansion and Israeli control. And I mean, he's got what he wanted, but there's that wonderful expression: "Be careful what you wish for." I think this, we will see, is not made Israel's position better. It's actually made it far, far worse. It might not be obvious at once, but in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, it's going to be a dreadful situation for the Israelis to find themselves in.
How about the United States? Because um, when Israel is stretching thin, but they are not pulling back, they keep on expanding. The United States seems to me, whether it's Trump or Biden, whoever, it doesn't matter. The US will keep on supporting Israel in all means and ways. Will this mean that US will be dragged in more and more into Syria?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what's going to happen. I mean, Trump, who wants to focus on China because he and so many of his people want to confront China, and some of the people that he's elected would probably quite like a war with China, just saying what they're going to find instead is that because of these extraordinary ambitions that Israel has and because of all the problems that have been created in the Middle East, they have the problems of the Middle East to worry about and take care of instead. So that instead of sending their army to fight China and, doing all they want to do against China, they're going to have to worry about what goes on in Syrian and Arab villages. And if this spreads, which it could easily do, by the way, to other Arab countries, right across the Middle East as well. Now, Trump, at some level, understands this. He said in a post that he did on X that these people are not really friendly to the United States, and it's better for the United States to stay out of it. But given the depth of his commitment to Israel and the strength of support for Israel within the political class in Washington, he might very well find it impossible to extricate himself from this situation. Now, the paradox of all of this is that there is a sort of narrative in the United States, which I don't take particularly seriously, by the way, but it says that the major winner of the forever wars that the United States got itself involved in the Middle East after 9/11 was China, because the United States was bogged down in the Middle East even as China rose. Well, if you think that, and there is some point there. If you think that, well, you should be very, very worried and upset about what's just happened in the Middle East, because we're probably presumably going to see all that all over again.
And who can you blame? China didn't say you need to keep on fighting in the Middle East, right? No. Whose decisions are, this forever war? Who made that decision?
Well, exactly. I mean, the point was that China has not played no role in this debacle at all. It's a fact. I mean, China's not in any way responsible. China's been trying to persuade people, and that's all it's done, by the way. It's not sent a single soldier or battleship or anything to the Middle East. It's not opened any bases there. What China has been trying to do is to get everybody to talk to everybody and try to find a way towards achieving stability and peace so that the region can come together and prosper and develop economically as it should. So it's not China's fault, but that doesn't mean that China won't be the country that will gain strategically the most from this. Though I want to stress again, no one in Beijing planned this or wanted this or desires this. China has never acted on the principle that in order to make itself strong and secure, it needs to create crises for other countries in other places. I've never known a single instance when China has done that.
In fact, there are people saying that like the fall of Assad probably is a setback for the Belt and Road Initiative, because China and the Assad government has very good relationship, and Assad has been supportive of the Belt and Road Initiative. Although it's a little bit hard to say, because this HTS, I sent you the statement, right? They sent out. They seem to want to. They wrote this statement in Chinese and Russia, mainly is talking to China and Russia. They, at least for now, they want to have a good relationship, and they're eager to get approval and recognition by both Russia and China, although I don't think it's going to happen real soon. But anyway, it's hard to say, whoever is taking over, what's going to happen. I think whoever is really want to develop Syria would look into continue to work with China, don't you think?
Well, absolutely. Well, any political force or political group that has any concern at all for the welfare of the people of Syria would want to have good relations with China and Russia. Any political force which wants to establish a stable, position governing Syria in its own interests would want long-term good relations with China and Russia. And some people in HTS have been talking like that. There's even been some suggestions from some people in HTS that Russia can keep its bases in western Syria. I don't think that anybody in Moscow believes that this is really sincere. But both China and Russia will do that which they always do, which is talk to everybody and see what can be agreed. And the Russians have just confirmed that they are in contact with HTS, even though it's a proscribed organization in Russia, but they've talked to the Taliban, they're talking to HTS. I'm sure the Chinese will as well. I, like yourself, am very skeptical that anything will come of this for a while, perhaps for any time.
I'm with you. I mean, Assad is not perfect, but he did kept the country together, and the Syria was stable under him. But now you have HTS. If HTS do have the full control of the country, I think relatively speaking could be okay. what it seems happening now is different countries are now coming in, grab whatever they can grab, which will eventually lead to a full-scale civil war of different factions, and of course the backers behind them are all got in. That would be the worst case scenario for the Syrian people, isn't it?
It would be an absolute tragedy and disaster for the Syrian people and all of these people who worked to try and overthrow Assad are bringing it about, and they will bear the responsibility for it. Now, if HTS really wants to preserve Syria, to guarantee Syrian territorial integrity, then logically they should look to those countries that would support Syria sincerely, in that China and Russia. The Russians could probably help in military terms. The Chinese could help in economic terms. Both countries would help in diplomatic terms. But of course, it is going to be very difficult, even if the Chinese and the Russians are involved. And of course, I follow what goes on in Russia very closely. And the overall mood there, which is very, very angry, is that Russia should not be involved in Syria anymore. That Russia made a big investment in Syria. It sent its air force there. It fought the predecessors of HTS. It's not going to commit more of its precious resources to fight for a country that won't fight for itself. So that's the mood in Moscow at the moment. So this has all been made much, much more difficult. But I'm afraid, looking forward, I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. We're now going to see a major power battle between Turkey, Israel, and the US for control of the various factions and communities in Syria. The Kurds look to the Americans, the jihadi fighters, the Islamists look to Turkey. Israel is playing its own game in the south. One way or the other, it's very difficult to have any kind of optimistic opinion about what's going to happen to Syria now. And from what I've heard, the entire civil administration of the country has collapsed. So have its armed forces, obviously. Its internal security system is collapsing as well. All the people have been released from the prisons, which is an incredible thing to do, even if you think some of the people there really are political prisoners, which maybe, and many of them no doubt are, and maybe they should have been released. But releasing everybody is going to guarantee that all kinds of violent criminals are now free in Syria to return to their life of violent crime. That's the reality of this. I mean, the whole thing is terrible, and anybody who genuinely cares for the people of Syria should knows that they're going to face a dark night and a terrible tragedy, and one which I don't know how they come out from.
I think the West kind of celebrating this. For one, they don't like Assad, but the other thing, I think the U.S. in particular probably see this as a they want to see some ripple effect, that this is an example of something. Because this morning I just saw that Serbia President Vucic, he came out, I guess, response to some of his opposition's statement. He came out. He said this. He said, "I want to tell those people who wish to destroy Serbia. I'm not Assad. I'm not going anywhere. I was born and have lived here in all my life. I will only serve the Serbia people, fight for Serbia, and never work for those countries who want to humiliate and destroy Serbia." So I think he made it very clear. Now, Serbia is a very different situation than Syria, right? But I think this is what the West want to see, that to make oppositions in countries they don't like, make them feel like that's hopeful or something, right?
That's exactly it. I mean, this is partly one of the reasons why they were so determined to overthrow Assad, because having said back in 2011 that Assad must go, it has been a humiliation for them that for so long he stayed. So getting rid of leaders who the West has said should go is a priority, because if they stay, it just proves the limits of Western power. So that there is this major psychological factor. And of course, it's also intended as a warning to other leaders in Serbia, in all kinds of places.
Yeah.
Unless you play our game, we will engineer sooner or later your overthrow. And that's partly what the drive behind all of this is. There's a very strong hegemonic drive as well. You know, terror, if you like. If you stand against us, we will destroy you. We will come after you personally, and if that means destroying your country, we will do it.
But I think actually it goes both ways, because if you read the comments of the Chinese media, both the comments for this the Wucici statement and also other related to Syria, I think overwhelmingly people are saying, well, Syria is telling us we have no choice but to support our government, our country, our government, our leaders, because we have to be unified. Otherwise, there's always outside forces trying to divide us. I see plenty of those comments. So it goes both ways. People do
Absolutely.
you destroy other countries by doing all these things, right?
Absolutely. People are saying the same in Russia, by the way. It's interesting that they're saying it in China, but they're saying that in Russia too. That what this proves is that you must be fully solid and disciplined and understand that if you start appeasing the West, then and playing the West's games, then you are putting at risk the entire internal stability and peaceful order of your own country. Now, I'm going to say something, by the way. The United States is far away from all this mess. They're a whole ocean away. If Syria goes up in flames, they're not affected. But the US's Arab allies potentially could be. And of course, the US's European allies could be as well, because, of course, if we get more refugee flows pouring out of Syria, moving towards Europe, because that's where they would go. And if this spreads to other countries in the Middle East, which heaven forbid, but it could happen, to Egypt, for example. Well, I read an article in the Daily Telegraph which said that Europe was almost destroyed by the previous refugee flood in 2015. It won't survive a second. But, nonetheless, we pay no attention to that. We cheer on Assad's fall. This is what we have to do. And, Gaddafi fell, then there was refugees from North Africa. The previous Syrian war led to a flood of refugees. Quite likely before long, we will see a further one. And the Europeans never seem to learn from this.
Yeah. Yeah, talking about, Tom and Daisy, the Great Gatsby, create a big mess, and then other people need to clean it up. That's very typical.
Exactly.
That's very typical US. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Talking about mess, so South Korea, all right. We thought he's going to resign, but he hasn't. And then they also failed impeachment. I think 2 votes short of the impeachment. But what's strange is that his own party, on the one hand, his own party seems abandon him. They said they want him to go. But then they're saying, okay, not immediately, not right now. They kind of like put everything on hold. They are saying the ruling party, I mean, they're not really ruling because they have the minority in the parliament, but they are the party of the president. So they're saying we took over the power from him, which is unconstitutional. I think you can't do that. But anyway, so what is your take on the situation now in South Korea?
Well, what is absolutely clear to me is that there's been lots of discussions and conversations behind the scenes between the ruling, let's call them the ruling party. I agree they're not the ruling party, but they are the effective power. The ruling party, the deep state in South Korea, which we talked about last time, the United States, all of them, they're absolutely horrified by the failure of this coup attempt. They're very, very worried that if the president falls, if there's new elections, if a new president comes in, this person will start to revisit all of the policies that the current president has been associated with. The alliance with Japan, which we talked about in our last program, the hostility to China, which South Korean people are not enthusiastic about, the backing for Ukraine, which South Korean people are also not enthusiastic about. They might even conceivably, as they have said, the opposition have said, start reaching out to North Korea again. So this must be prevented at all costs. So even though the president is completely discredited and without support, we keep him there, not really because we support him anymore, but simply in order to prevent the opposition from getting their own people in place to take over from him. So that simply prolongs the crisis. It creates instability in South Korea. It ignores the future and the condition of the South Korean people. It probably will result in economic problems, because when this sort of thing happens in a country, economic problems usually follow. But that's what it probably will do. And by the way, just to add quickly, sanctions probably play a significant part in this. Obviously, the anti-Russian sanctions, of which South Korea is a part, that's one thing. But far more important, the restrictions that the South Koreans, under the current president, have agreed to in terms of supplying advanced chips and that kind of thing to China. We can't have them doing that, so we try and stop them re-establishing their good relations with China. So this is what it's all about. Again, sacrificing the interests of South Korea, of the Korean people, all of the Korean people, North and South, by the way, who need peace, is sacrificing all of that, again, to the greater geopolitical interest, which is this confrontation with China, which is what has to take priority over all else. As I've said in many programs, always at the back of it, China for the West is the big thing.
Now, in your program, you talked about your own theory, why this happened right now. Can you explain that too? I think it's a very interesting theory.
I think the single event that provoked it is, of course, the Biden administration is now in its last days. It's been trying to find weapons to send to Ukraine. It can't find weapons in the United States to send to Ukraine because its own arsenals are now heavily depleted. The Europeans have failed to produce their own weapons in sufficient quantity. South Korea has lots and lots and lots of weapons. So the idea was give Ukraine a lot of money from the Russian assets and have Ukraine buy arms from South Korea. And that will keep Ukraine armed and fighting for at least another year, complicating any peace initiative that Donald Trump wants to undertake. So the South Korean president showed every sign of going along with this. Last year, in 2023, he supplied 500,000 artillery shells to the United States, bypassing South Korean laws. Those shells, as we all knew, ended up in Ukraine. He seemed to be very willing to go along with it this time. There was all the talk about the North Korean soldiers in Russia, in Kursk region, supposedly there. Nobody can see them. Nobody can find any evidence that they exist. But supposedly there, that was used to justify getting the South Koreans to supply weapons to Ukraine. Except, of course, that the South Korean people were not fooled. Overwhelming opposition to this idea in South Korea. The opposition parties strongly opposed. The South Korean parliament opposed because the South Korean opposition parties have the majority. So in order to get this thing done and declare martial law, have the parliament dissolved, and then go ahead and supply the arms to Ukraine in the way that I've just described. I personally, I don't know this, and I want to stress this is speculation, but I think this is the most likely explanation for what happened. It's the sort of thing I can imagine this particular administration doing as their way to try to keep the Ukraine war going. By the way, before I did this program, I got a rather interesting email from someone whom I can't disclose, but somebody who's very well informed. And he says that the latest plan, by the way, is to supply Ukraine with weapons from Syria. So Syria's collapsed. There's large numbers of weapons there, shells, artillery pieces, armored vehicles. Get a hold of as many of them as possible in the weeks available, and send them to Ukraine. I mean, why not? Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I want to share with you in China. I think I haven't heard anybody in China have your theory, but there is another theory in terms of why it happened right now. Now, of course, we talked about it, his trouble, his wife's trouble, all those things, but none of them is imminent, right? So why now that he felt so compelled? So one theory in China is that, or their rumor, I wouldn't say a theory, but there are rumors saying that, again, going back to Biden administration, wanted him to start some kind of a provocation against the North Korea. Because of the balloon, we talked about the balloon thing, back and forth thing. Now, so far, nothing has come as really serious, but it's just a balloon, kind of a more propaganda probably than anything else. But the Biden administration apparently wanted, according to this rumor, wanted South Korea to do more to provoke North Korea. And then, of course, that again, he will have to bypass the parliament if he wants to do anything serious. And so again, that is a little bit similar to your theory, is that Biden wanted him to do something and he felt that his hands are tied. So having the martial law, then he consolidated all the power with himself. And then, he can just do whatever the US asks him to do. I think it's actually reasonable to assume that's probably what's going on, because the martial law cannot happen without the support of the military. And we all know South Korean military is not fully under the South Korean control. It's the US control the South Korean military. So if he's going to do that, at least he need to let the US know. At least the US need to support him for that, right? Isn't it?
I completely agree. Now, can I just say that's a very interesting theory, and I think that's probably true. And can I also say that my theory and that theory complement each other? They don't contradict each other. There are all sorts of things that they wanted the current president to do, and which he wasn't able to do because of the constraints placed upon him by South Korean law, by South Korean public opinion, and by the opposition of the parliament. So get him to declare martial law, and suddenly all sorts of things become possible. That was the plan. And I get to just go further than this. I think it's become increasingly clear, the more we learn about this coup attempt, that it wasn't the president who actually came up with the plan. Definitely he was willing to do it. He had concerns for his wife. He had all those worries. All of those things undoubtedly did play a role. But the initiative for it seems to have come from some elements within the South Korean military. Now, we haven't got the whole picture, but of course, as you absolutely rightly say, the South Korean military are very, very tied in with the US. They don't do anything without the US knowing about it in advance. And I'm sure that the US knew about what was coming. And not only because there is nothing that can happen that the South Korean military would do that the Americans don't know about previously. It's also important to say the president himself, the South Korean president, is fervently pro-American. So, I mean, he would probably want to consult the US also. But one could see in the behavior of the administration, the US government, that they were far from unsympathetic to what the president was trying to do and the military officials were trying to do. They never condemned it. They never came out and spoke out against it. They never threatened the president with sanctions or the military officials with sanctions. They've sanctioned all those people in Georgia in the government and the police who are, peacefully coping with the protests there. They're happy to condemn and sanction them. But here's a president, he sponsor dissolve the democratically elected parliament, arrest opposition leaders, close down newspapers? Does the United States come out and say, no, this is outrageous, this is completely wrong, you must stop doing this at once, which in South Korea would have caused the whole thing to collapse instantly? No, the United States just sits on its hands and says nothing except the fact that they back South Korea 100%, which is in their way of saying that they back what the president is doing.
Yeah. There was even a suggestion from the Hill. There was somebody suggesting that Biden and Trump should get together and arrange some kind of an exile for President Yoon to come to Hawaii. They were even talking about that, which tells you it's the U.S. who determines these things, right? That they are the
And
ones.
not only is that, it not only is it does it show you that, but it also shows that they want President Yoon out of the way so that he isn't going to be questioned and start providing difficult answers to what the Americans might feel are dangerous questions. It's a very, very interesting suggestion, and it tells you an awful lot about what's really going on. By the way, the media in Britain, to the extent that they've covered this story, have all shown extraordinary degree of sympathy for the president. I mean, mostly they're worried not about what exactly has happened, but about the direction that South Korea itself is going to take. Is it going to start becoming more pro-Chinese, as they put
it? Okay. Annalena Baerbock, right? We talked a little bit that she was visiting China. So I see the readout. I don't know if you get a chance to see it. So
no.
I find it's interesting. This is what the China side said. Okay, so Wang Yi said that China and Germany, as the world's second and third largest economies, should overcome obstacles, remove barriers, uphold the underlying tone of dialogue and cooperation, discard outdated Cold War and confrontational mentality, and work together to fend off external risks and address global challenges. The two sides should strive to be advocates of pragmatic cooperation, champions of openness and development, and the role models for unilateralism. Okay, and this is what they said. Baerbock and Baerbock was saying, in the face of a turbulent world, it is of great significance to maintain candid dialogue and strengthen strategic communication with China, which is conducive to maintain the right direction of development of bilateral relations and contributing to world peace and stability. Seems to me, when they say candid dialogue, I got the feeling it probably didn't go very well. It wasn't that friendly. What is your take?
That's exactly right. That's exactly what it means. I mean, in Cold War days, I always remember reading, readouts, and there was a particular language that was used, especially by the Russians at that time, which is that when there was a free and frank exchange of views, that meant that there was a row. I mean, you absolutely knew that. I think there was less than a row here, but in some ways, what the Chinese readout says is even more interesting than the word candid, because why would China, the Chinese side, need to list all of these things if this was a good relationship already? I mean, why would the Chinese need to point all of these things out? It looks to me that yet again, China is trying to explain as politely as it can, but as clearly as it can, to the German side, in this case, to Baerbock, look, what you're doing is contrary to your own interests. These are the things we need to do for your sake, for our sake, for the sake of peace and stability across the world. And of what Baerbock says in response is that a candid dialogue means that we don't basically agree with you, but we do need to keep communications open. So it doesn't look like it was a successful visit, if I could put it as simply as that.
Yeah. I mean, nothing new with Baerbock. I don't expect anything from her now. But, yeah. What's interesting, okay, talking about China and U.S. relations. So Trump recently had an interview with NBC, Meet the Press. Now I think it's a very interesting interview. So I mainly pay attention, of course, for what he's talking about China. So he did say he and Xi Jinping had a conversation. He said they were in communication. He said like 3 days ago. Okay, this was this week, last weekend, last Sunday. And one thing interesting is that of course the NBC interviewer Kristen Welker is always they're always very provocative, saying, "Can you promise to defend Taiwan if it's got invaded?" And Trump just said, "No, I will never do that." Okay, so that I think is very good that he never do that. He actually said something interesting. He said, "I'm not going to put myself into Joe Biden's position. Oh, I'm not going to pardon this, my son." But then he pardoned. I would never do that, which I think is it's interesting. But anyway, so he's not promising that he would do anything. But the interesting thing he said is that he and Xi Jinping actually was talking, but he said they were not talking about Taiwan. He said, I think they were talking about just one issue, Ukraine, seems to me. Do you think he's going to involve China for the negotiations now?
Well, he's talking about it. I mean, he's actually said that China might be able to help. Just before we started doing this program, we got information that the Hungarian Prime Minister, who's just met with Trump, had a long conversation with Putin in Moscow to talk about, and it was clearly that they were talking about Ukraine. In fact, the Russian readout makes that absolutely clear, and Orban himself has just tweeted about this. So moves are underway to try to bring us to some kind of at least understanding about the situation in Ukraine, to establish guardrails, to use this expression that you see so often in Chinese readouts, about how this problem can be managed and to try to find some way out. And I think Trump understands. He's a more experienced political leader than he was 8 years ago, that it's better to work on this with the Chinese side than try to exclude them. And that does require some degree of dialogue with China. So yes, I think they were talking about Ukraine, but I don't think they were only talking about Ukraine. I think they did talk about Taiwan. And the reason they would have talked about Taiwan is that I think it is inconceivable that Xi Jinping would not have brought it up. I mean, I can't imagine that after all that's been happening over the last 4 years, that Xi Jinping would not have brought it up, even though he probably would have done so. As he always does, by the way. Xi Jinping is extremely courteous man. This is what I've heard from many, many people. Every so often, he can speak very, very frankly, as he did with Biden, where he told Biden, "You're lying to me," and as he famously did to Justin Trudeau. But generally, Xi Jinping's approach is that he's extremely polite in all his discussions. He's absolutely not someone who likes to throw his weight around. But I think that, Xi Jinping will have wanted to remind Trump that Taiwan for China is a red line. And I think that Trump probably understands that, and not only understands that, but probably realizes at some level that it would be very dangerous for him and for the United States to try to cross that red line. Now, Xi Jinping and Trump have in the past got on quite well. I mean, there's obviously huge disagreements between the two, but they can talk to each other. So I think it's a good sign that they're talking, by the way. And I think it's a good sign that the administration, using Orban, is now contacting the Russians and is talking about a Ukraine settlement. So we'll see where this goes.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think Xi Jinping is a very a courteous man. But because of that, when he does be very frank, everybody remembers, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is exactly right. It's even more shattering because and it comes across more powerfully, precisely because most of the time he is very, very polite.
Yeah. And I just remember now that at one time he was talking to, I think, both the domestic and the foreign correspondents. And he just said that well, China, we don't exporting democracy. We don't start, interfere other people's business, their own policies. We just want to do trade, so benefit both sides. Why we constantly being criticized and demonized? I remember that very well. I was a little bit surprised, taken back that he was so, and his tone
Yeah.
was kind of like a little bit irritated. So I
Yes.
remember I was like, it's a rare for him to express that. He must feel very strongly at that particular moment for maybe some questions or something, I feel.
Quite plausibly. As I said,
Yeah.
I don't. I think no one should mistake this for weakness.
Yeah.
I mean, politeness is, in fact, more often better understood, especially when it comes from China, as a sign of strength.
Yeah.
It's getting angry, losing your temper, banging the table that's a sign of weakness. So I think people need to understand that about the way in which Xi Jinping conducts negotiations. Now, I know that he's polite because I've heard from people who've been involved in negotiations with him say this. I mean, they also say something else, by the way, just for people in China. I'm sure they know it already, but he has all his facts at his fingertips. He is always exceptionally well prepared for every meeting. If you go into a meeting and you're not well prepared against Xi Jinping, I mean, God help you. I mean, that's what I've heard too.
Another interesting conversation I saw is between Alexander Dugan and John Mearsheimer,
Yeah,
which is long, and I saw parts of
yeah,
it and then speed up. And so one thing I find interesting is that they two seems to agree a lot of things. And the one thing they both agree on, I'm a little bit surprised, is that the Ukraine war will not quickly ended with negotiation. They actually both think it's
yeah.
going to continue to fight an ugly fight, using Mearsheimer's word, an ugly fight to the end. Is that
Mm.
what you?
Absolutely, but there's a difference here because, of course, that's the outcome that Dugin wants, and it's the outcome that Mearsheimer expects. I mean, if you know Dugin at all, I mean, he basically wants Russia to take a completely uncompromising line to Ukraine. He sees any negotiation at all. Which has a good outcome as leading to surrender. So so there is that difference between them. But nonetheless, I mean, it's not surprising. I mean, one has to make a distinction between Dugin, the real
Mhm.
intellectual, who's actually very interesting and highly intelligent, and Dugin, the cartoon figure that you read about in the media, who is a completely different person again. I mean, the you know, bizarre neo-fascist,
Wow.
ethno-nationalist, extremist, radical authoritarian person that Dugin is meant to be just doesn't correspond to any sort of reality. He is somebody who cares very much about Russian national interests, who has a genuine, highly developed hostility to Western liberalism, which he sees as a major cause of problems in the world. I mean, what he calls liberalism, I mean, it's also what I think a lot of it, Chinese people would use the word hegemonism
Mhm. Mhm.
to describe it. Um, the Russians use a somewhat different terminology because for Dugin, the domestic ideology inevitably leads to the foreign policy and the ideology as well. So he's very, very hostile to all of that. Um, but he wants, Russia to become a strong state. He wants it to
Mhm.
reassert itself throughout the whole Soviet space. He doesn't really believe, I think, in an independent Ukraine. I don't
Mhm.
think he's ever really believed in an independent Ukraine, and he wants the war to continue towards a
Mhm.
complete victory. But he does, like Mearsheimer, have overall a very tough-minded and realistic view about international affairs.
Well, I think they probably right in the sense from what I see
Mm,
that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government, they seem like they're willing to give up territories, but there is one thing they definitely want is to join NATO.
Yeah.
They don't seem backing down on this one. Now, that is the red line for Russia.
Yeah.
That's the whole war is about, is to not to allow Ukraine to join NATO. So if both sides insist on this, there is no middle ground to talk, right?
Absolutely. And I gather that was what the point that Putin made to Orban. If you read the
Mm-hmm.
Russian readout, I mean, it doesn't actually mention NATO, but it's fairly clear that this is what Putin was talking about. He said that Kiev, the Kiev regime, as he always calls it,
Mm-hmm.
has no interest in negotiations. They're not showing any real sign of wanting to negotiate because on the key issue, which is NATO membership, they're not showing any willingness to, to talk or to compromise. And I think this is going to be an insurmountable barrier because I don't think that Zelensky, who was prepared to consider neutral status for Ukraine back in 2022, has any way back to that position now. Giving up on NATO after 3 years of war
Mm-hmm.
is like giving up on Ukraine's stated aspiration to become part of the West and to define itself as an anti-Russian country. So for the Ukrainians themselves, it's become totemic. So I don't think they'll give up on it. And the Russians have completely made it clear that they will never agree to Ukraine joining NATO. I think the Trump administration has made it fairly clear that they're not interested in Ukraine joining NATO. But it looks to me that, without that shift from the Ukrainians, we're not really realistically going to get past first base.
In a way, I kind of understand Zelensky thinking because, like you said, right, after 3 years of war, if they don't even join NATO, it seems like they don't get anything, right? That they get it in the end that the country will be in much worse shape than, for example, if they really take the Minsk agreement seriously, right?
Oh, absolutely. But then whose fault is that? I mean,
Yeah,
Zelensky had a peace deal um,
yeah.
on the table in April 2022, and he walked away from it.
Mm.
So it's all very well him saying this now, but he's brought himself and his country to this point, and I'm afraid he's not the only person in Ukraine. I mean, uh, um, a lot of other people in Ukraine in the leadership have made the same mistake. But there it is. I mean, there's no real rewinding back to what might have existed before. The Minsk agreement, which of course Ukraine refused to fulfill, didn't
Mhm.
mention at all NATO at all.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess because of that, so they feel like if they get into NATO, at least they got something, for the
Yeah.
3 years, yeah, for their loss.
Well,
But
the trouble is they don't just think they'd get something. They've convinced themselves that if they get into NATO, they'll get back everything. That Ukraine in NATO will be in such a strong position that eventually it will oblige Russia to give up Crimea and all of the other regions.
okay.
So the Russians understand that, they see that, and that, of course, makes them even more determined to see this through, and to
Mm.
see this through on the basis that Ukraine will never join NATO at all.
Okay, one more thing that Trump talked about in the interview is about TikTok, which I find
Mm.
also interesting. Now it's kind of related to China, right? So he didn't say it definitively, but it sounds like he would want to see if there's some way he can help TikTok. Okay.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is this, that the appeal court rejected the TikTok appeal. What's the rejection? Interesting is that essentially the appeal court just said, if you read I think there are 90 pages of writing explaining why they rejected it, because they said that they agree that this TikTok ban is unconstitutional. It is against the First Amendment. But because it's owned by China, so there is national security concerns that the Congress has the right to consider. What I think interesting, you're a lawyer, and I think you also is one of those people who truly believe that in the United States, Constitution is very holy. I agree with you. I thought that's true. But in this case, these three judges, they even admitted this is unconstitutional, and yet they don't reject that. I think the moment you find this is unconstitutional, you should reject it. The
Well, of course.
Constitution never said that under special circumstances you can ignore it, right?
Well, that's absolutely correct. I mean, it is. I mean, what that court has said isn't law; it is anti-law. It says that the Constitution applies all the time, except when it doesn't. I mean, that really doesn't make any kind of sense at all. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I so it is an absurd reasoning, legally
Yeah.
speaking. But of course, we know why it's been done, and of course, we've seen so much of this now. I mean, I used to believe that the Americans took their constitution seriously. I'm much less convinced of that any longer, to be honest. And it wasn't just this court case that made me doubt this. So, I mean, that's where we are. About TikTok, of course, from Trump's point of view, he's probably a little bit more sympathetic to TikTok because, being realistic about it, was the only social media platform that gave him any time when all of the others were closing down upon him. But, there's still a very, very strong impulse to go after TikTok. And notice that in Europe, the Romanian elections have just been annulled because of a supposed Russian social media campaign in favor of the candidate who won the first round, which took place where? On TikTok. So you can see that TikTok is going to be blamed for everything.
Yeah, Trump actually did say that this time, the election, he did well among youth. He did say he credited TikTok for that. He said,
Yeah,
I do very well in TikTok. And
yeah,
yeah, so, okay. We will see then if he sounds like he's opening the
yeah,
door that he will try to help out
yeah,
somehow, but we will
yes,
see. Yeah. Um, there is a murder. I don't know if you pay attention to the United Healthcare CEO, Brian
yeah,
Thompson.
absolutely. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
impossible to avoid it. I mean, it's been all over the media here in Britain as well, by the way.
Oh, yeah. What's surprising to me is the reaction to it. I have to
Mm,
say I was surprised. I was stunned, but that
mm,
there's absolutely no sympathy for the guy. I think people are truly angry with United Healthcare.
mm.
Probably they're angry with all the healthcare insurance, but in particular United Healthcare. So everybody's talking about their horror stories and about this. What is your take on this whole thing? That
I
people
think
just
that's
angry.
exact. I think that's exactly right. Now, I mean, I don't approve of murdering people.
Mhm.
Absolutely not. I think that's a
Mhm.
terrible thing. But that there is huge anger in across the United States about the way in which this insurance company functions, and the fact that people pay huge amounts for insurance, and then they find that when they need medical care, they still have thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of dollars to pay. And it makes people very, very, very angry. And it makes them sense that this company and the CEO has been living off them. Of course, it has been to some extent, and isn't delivering any kind of proper service in return. And by the way, in Britain, where a lot of British people have followed the story very closely, believe it or not, there's much of the same criticism because, of course, the British are terrified. The British public are terrified that the healthcare care system, which is state-owned, will be broken down and abolished, and that we will have something like the American system brought over here. So they're saying, look, what happened in America. If we don't preserve our NHS, the same thing will happen, and you see how the Americans feel about it. So I'm not. I mean, I was shocked. I was surprised. I was surprised, but I can understand many of these comments, and the fact that the comments are so strong and so numerous. They last week I did just after the murder took place. I did a live stream on the Duran's local channel, and there was a stream of comments from members of our own Duran community coming along, giving terrible stories about what had happened to them in the United States and why they didn't have any regrets for the murder of this man.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just the sentiment is very strong. That is surprising to me. That it seems like, yeah. Okay, one last thing, a little bit kind of on the light side. I just read that in Britain, Nick Candy, I guess he's a billionaire or something. Nick Candy, he promised he's going to give like a 7 figures donation to Reform Party. Is he going to try to be the UK's Elon Musk or something? What's going on here?
Quite plausibly. I mean, I should say that there is a general sense now that reform might go on rising. I believe it's actually overtaken the Labour Party, which remember is the government party in the polls. So it seems to be rising in support all the time. And of course, on the basis that everybody loves a winner, all these people who want to be powerful and important are now seeing Reform as the party that they should support. And so it's perhaps not surprising that big donors are coming forward and also are hoping to use Reform, no doubt, to promote their own particular agendas. I think this is dangerous for Reform, by the way. I encountered Nigel Farage in person for the first time, I should say, when I was in Kuala Lumpur a few weeks ago. I was rather unimpressed by him. Just saying, I mean, he made less of an impression on me than I thought he would. In fact, seeing him up close, he didn't seem to me to be the leader that Britain needs. Just to say, not remotely so. But anyway, I think this is dangerous for Reform because even more than the Trump movement in the United States, Reform has set itself up as the anti-establishment movement that supports working class people, that's based on the interests of the people, the working people of Britain. If it suddenly starts attracting support from wealthy oligarchs, then I think that might start making many of its current working class supporters rather more critical of what it stands for. And what it stands for, by the way, in many things, is very, very much a very right-wing, very free market approach to economics. It, for example, wants to introduce elements of insurance systems into the NHS, just saying, which might not be popular at all with its current working class base. So I think it's a dangerous game that they're playing. But anyway, in the meantime, I suspect they'll take the money because politicians in Britain always do, even Reform ones.
So is Reform Party trying to position itself a little bit like the MAGA to attract people like the MAGA people? Is that what they're trying to position themselves?
It says so, and up to now, it's been relatively successful because, of course, the Labour Party has moved very, very far away from its working class base, more so actually than the MAGA movement has done in the United States. So they've been fairly successful on this. They've pushed their cultural issues, the fact that they're anti-woke, which they assume working class voters like, which to some extent they do. The anti-immigrant position, which working class voters absolutely like, that's gained them a certain amount of traction. But on economic questions, they are more strongly on the free market right than MAGA is. MAGA is a more complex movement. I mean, you have people like J.D. Vance, for example, who seem to be more open to more interventionist economics. Reform isn't like that at all. I mean, they are absolute, pure, liberal, free market, ultra free market supporters, like the AfD in Germany is also, by the way.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that the Reform Party doing well now is, I guess, that people are desperate to find alternatives, right? That the two party is not working for them, so whoever is different, they put their hope there. Yeah,
that's right. on economics, voting surveys show that the general mood in Britain tilts at the moment rather strongly to the left. So there is no left-wing alternative to the Labour Party in Britain, not a viable one. I mean, there's various attempts to form left-wing parties, but none of them have been successful. So for the moment, Reform has collected to itself the anti-establishment vote, both the right-wing and the left-wing parts of it. If a left-wing alternative, which is culturally conservative, supports Brexit and is opposed to immigration, ever emerges in Britain, and establishes itself and does so in a stable way with attractive leaders, then attractive working class leaders, then Reform could find itself in trouble.
Yeah. Well, I think the same thing with Trump. I think Trump's economic policies, I'm not sure is most people would support. No. He will also be very like a free market. He lowered the taxes for the rich and those sort of policies that will not ultimately solve the problem. Yeah. So yeah.
Absolutely. I entirely agree with that. By the way, just to say, I read a really outstanding article, since we're talking about economics, very briefly, an outstanding article in Global Times contrasting the military-industrial complex in the United States with the way in which factories in China produce arms. And the point it made was that there is basically no military-industrial complex in China. There are factories which are outgrowths of the great Chinese manufacturing industry that produce weapons based on China's security needs. But there's nothing analogous to that in the United States. And the American attempt to reindustrialize, to the extent that it is focused on making the United States militarily powerful again, is basically about setting up factories whose only function is to produce weapons. And it said not just that, but that these are factories of death, basically. It was very vivid, but a very insightful analysis indeed, and one that, by the way, is relevant to British and American history. Again, if you go back to the 1940s, when Britain and the United States were big industrial powers, their industrial system was much more like the Chinese in those days. They didn't have a military industrial complex per se. They had factories that built aircraft. Some of those were military aircraft, but most of them were for the civilian economy, and the same was true right across the industrial system. And I think that in the United States, there is no real understanding of this difference, and there isn't on the Trump side either, actually.
Yeah, in fact, I think in terms of to make it worse, is that lots of the senators, for example, they push really hard to fight for military contracts. They want to bring those contracts to their own state. That's where they see the jobs are, right? So that will almost make it worse, because then they vote for military bills because they want a piece of that. So that's part of the reason they support all these weapon deals, weapon support here and there around the world, right? So that's, I think, part of the problem is that.
It's a huge part of the problem. And we come back to one of the fundamental differences between China and the United States, because what that means is that in order to develop the economy of their state and to get support there, senators are focused on the Pentagon and on the on the government, and getting the government to fund military programs in their states. Whereas in China, in the regions, we call them provinces in China. I don't know whether that's an appropriate translation, by the way, but in Xinjiang wherever, Fujian or wherever it is. The local government is focused on developing good conditions to create a strong economy there, and it isn't always looking at getting, huge subsidies from Beijing, to build arms factories. So it creates a very different environment. It means that the regional governments are much more focused on the entire economic picture within their areas than they are in the United States.
I'll let you go. Thank you so much. It's so interesting. So, I mean, from last week to this week, there was a lot of things happening, right? So
I've never known it. I have never known a time like this. I mean, the pace of events is astonishing, and one wonders when or if it will ever slow down.
you feel like at this time, I feel like this transition from Biden to Trump is very long. It never feels that long, like in the past, because so many things happening, right?
Absolutely. Well, there's also a feverish quality about it. The latest reports in the US say, for example, that the Biden team are now preparing a massive further sanctions package against Russia to try to stop Russia exporting oil. So, which anyway, we'll no doubt, if it happens, we'll talk about that next week. But I mean, you can see that they can't stop. And they can't rest. It's very, very extraordinary, actually.
It's not that long ago. They just, I think, 1 or 2 weeks ago, they had another list of 140 Chinese companies that the news. It's just like endless sanctions. They just keep on sanctioning. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Endless sanctions, endless pressure. Still trying to cling on to the threads of their policies, and cause as much trouble as they possibly can in the 40 days that's left.
Yeah. We will see what happens next week. Okay.
Indeed. Have a great week. Have a great week. I hope my voice will be fully back when we speak again next week. Okay, so
thank you.
Good to see you.
Bye.